and for some people who were never allowed to act like they were old, you know, can suddenly act old and say like, and even it's made people who people with Peter Pan complexes, like my mum and my dad, who just would not stop. It's made them feel vulnerable, which is of course sad. It's made people who never didn't feel old suddenly realize they were old, you know, even someone like my dad, who's just sort of unstoppable and never gets sick, at some point early in Corona realized he was at the age that, you know, if the
really
hospitals were full, he would be denied treatment first, you know, because they'd write him off as kind of one foot in the grave already kind of thing. Like, I think that's shocking.
It is shocking. It is an interesting point, though, how like you realize your own age in a way.
Yeah, but also the kind of ageism that this whole thing sparked.
I mean, I guess that's one thing with architects, is that because the profession is so slow, it takes a certain time to get started, and then you just carry on until the very end, right?
Of course. But I read somewhere that actually your brain is most able to kind of retain and accumulate information and facts, or process information and facts in your 70s, you know? So this whole idea that we should kind of retire and stop is of course not, there's no kind of neurological basis to that. It's just a kind of pattern.
Yes. It's a social basis. It's a kind of pension funds and things. And
yeah, exactly. It's not to do with when you have the kind of most potential to create a masterpiece or something, you know?
Yeah. I mean, there is something interesting in that, given how much you've been surrounded with architecture and, you know, being able to observe the making of buildings. I mean, why do you think you're not an architect?
Well, you know, I was sort of surrounded by architecture, but then really not really, you know. It was a still very distant thing, you know, because it's not something, I mean, any architect who has a family knows that they hardly see their family. It's not that their family sees loads of architecture, it's a kind of inverse. And you know what I mean? And so and it's not really, and the problem with architecture is that it's a kind of, for most of it, it's all theoretical and it's all potential and it's all planned and things that are, quite frankly, aren't very exciting, especially not to a, you know, a child, you know. So it's something that you can only kind of really present to anyone in a kind of interesting form when it's done, you know, and then there's that final moment. So it's not something, a kind of process that I could be engaged with, you know, so I wasn't. And I think a lot of people always expect me to know something about architecture, or know about, that my kind of, my connection to architects has led me to understand architecture and know about it, which is definitely not the case at all.
Right.
You know, so people are always kind of disappointed that I know nothing about architecture, but I was just very much.
But surely you were dragged around to see buildings, or?
Definitely, like I was dragged around to see buildings. I mean, all our kind of family holidays were traipsing around to see, you know, churches and buildings, and so I was, in that sense, I had an awareness. I grew up with an awareness of architecture, an interest. I looked at buildings in a way that I noticed my friends didn't. I looked around, I saw them, they lived to me, you know. And then I see that now in my pictures, you know, that, and in my book, is that, you know, buildings and people, they're all characters in a city, in a kind of story, you know. And I know, and it's just what I notice, you know. But at the same time, I don't have any kind of trained understanding of what good architecture is and bad architecture. So also in my book, you see that I like the ugly, the really tacky, weird things that, you know, I like funny buildings. And so I don't have a kind of aesthetic judgment around buildings that architects definitely have. You know, there's this obsession with what's good taste and what's bad taste.
You do have the irony, I guess.
What do you mean?
Well, there is a kind of ironic, well, maybe I see it as irony, maybe you don't actually see it as irony. Like when I see things that you value, I feel like, I mean, I do see value in them. I share your view, but I'm just thinking maybe you're trying to make a kind of a subverted point, you know, like maybe you're kind of ironic about buildings or...
Yeah, definitely. But I also appreciate the kind of ugly, funny ones, the ones that went wrong, the ones that tried something that and it hasn't worked. You know, I appreciate those because they kind of add something. They add humor, you know, they add wrongness, you know. So the thing is, for me, there's nothing interesting about kind of like an architecture magazine. So I don't have that kind of interest in you know, because something that's kind of perfectly executed design that's not my interest, you know. It's just about how the buildings give kind of like a character, unique character, and how they are characters, you know. So I feel like,
because I guess the architecture magazine is never really the reality, and you're kind of one step closer to actually reality rather than this kind of idealized image.
Yeah, exactly. And also I like a way that all kind of different architectures like react to each other, and different styles react to each other and interact and conflict, you know. So I always, when I take photos, I always look at everything within the context, you know, and how the kind of exactly that ideal has inevitably been kind of skewed by the context, you know, and how the context changes every kind of plan and every design.
Because nothing is really a kind of a dual object standing in floating in midair, but you do, that is one amazing quality of your images, is that there is always like, it's always about the everything else.
Yeah, and also, I mean, that's what, for instance, we talk about, you know, and we can see that there's these kind of like this sort of generic kind of global kind of style of architecture. So you see it in Rotterdam, and you see it in Guangzhou, and you see it in Dubai, and you see it in, you know, every London, you see the same buildings.
Yeah.
But then at the same time, they always appear out of a completely different context. So
yeah,
you could say in some way we're all looking the same, but somehow in another way, that same building starts to make that different context even more obvious. So sometimes these kind of the generic elements of a city, or the generic architecture, actually increases the sort of look of the differences.
Yeah. There's something interesting in this idea of you being a child that is dragged around to see things. And I think that's maybe where your kind of way of seeing starts, right? And I'm just wondering whether maybe there was a certain building that you can recall, or an experience that you can recall from those, you know, years in your childhood, for example, where you really kind of had a moment of, well, a realization, or, you know, whether it's a building or whether it's a city.
Well, I think that I have to say that friend being an architect, I think, I mean, we did that. We went to see things, you know, on holidays, you know, but Rem didn't in any way impose his knowledge or his understanding, or even maybe share it with us, his interests. You know, so I think it was much less of an influence, you know, than people you would imagine, you know, because when he came back to London to be with his family, you know, he was most of the time he was away working, And when he came back, he wasn't, you know, he would just sort of be in our context, and our context was sort of very different. It was a very different lives, you know. But I grew up in London, and I was very in a kind of it was where urban culture was being made and that's what I write about in the book.
Yeah.
So when I contextualize my work in the book with this kind of personal story about my background, I don't talk about REM, but I do talk about, you know, the rave scene and the music scene in London, and of course these kind of like the brutalist housing projects. I grew up in West Hampstead, but very close to Swiss Cottage, which had also Kilburn, which had all these. So I really was impacted by the atmosphere of those kind of buildings and those kind of living conditions, and very much out this kind of like social housing, you know. And then I went to a school where a lot of people lived in these kind of social housing projects around that area. And so, you know, those had a kind of, you know, a Blade Runner type darkness to them. And at the same time, within those kind of environments, a huge amount of creative things were happening, and culture was being born. And that's where pirate radio stations came from. And that's where, you know, London, from those housing estates, from those abandoned housing projects, you know, London's music scene developed, you know. So that kind of conflict between what it looked like and what it was, and in a way, the absence of, you know, luxury and just maybe hope, came something incredibly kind of interesting. So I think that's what London taught me to understand, that, you know, that there's something else inside, you know, inside of what it looks like. There
I think
there's
something, yeah. I mean, that's kind of fantastic, because you say how Rem didn't quite impose his knowledge, yet obviously you developed in a manner that you just say, like London's kind of influenced you so much as a city. But then, you know, I remember last time you were saying how Rem asks you to go to photograph a library in Qatar, yeah, because he wants that kind of, to kind of extract that kind of life quality that you were able to construct in your work from these kind of other different experiences. That there is a kind of dialogue within that, within your work.
Yeah, and of course we as his kids living in North London, you know, which was a very different, for him, it was a very different world from what he was experiencing in kind of, you know, professional architectural context, where he was thinking about kind of urbanism and from a very broad scale.
Yeah.
But then he had this engagement through us of real urban life, you know, and the kind of culture, because as an architect, you create something, but you hope that you leave space for real culture to inhabit it, you know, but you don't determine that culture, you know. And so and what's interesting about London is that some of the places with the least planning and the least resources and the least thought, you know, the ones that had an absence of architecture, the absence of planning, and again I say it's like it was the abandoned buildings, you know, the abandoned buildings that left room for kind of real creative cultural production. And that's completely out of the hands of an architect, you know. And I can imagine if you're an architect, it's exciting to see that, you know, that because you imagine your own importance and you imagine your own, you know, it seems like you're designing the world, you know, but it also must be exciting to see the limits of what's up to you, you know, and also the potential, what people can do with, you know, every potential space.
I guess it's this idea of exercising control and giving up control, maybe.
Yeah, and I think my book really is about that, about, okay, what is urban culture? You know, it's a mixture of its life meeting the kind of structures.
Is it a kind of a memoir, or how do you see it as a form?
The thing is that I would never, it was funny because I was trying to make that book for like nearly 15 years. So in 2007, 8, I started to work on a book. And then I nearly made it with another publisher in 2011. And at that time, I had zero plans to put any, or at least I was confronted with the problem of how do I put a caption to it? Yeah, so I wanted to show how you could no longer see which city you were in, so that you know, in London there is that you could find yourself in places that look like Lagos and vice versa, and were actually directly had been influenced by each other, sometimes even made by the same architects. So I wanted a book that would confuse you, so you didn't know where you were anymore. And so that was always the problem, you know, because the problem with photography is that the minute you put a caption to it, text always becomes the authority over the image.
Yeah.
So it was like, so if you put a caption, then people, rather than looking and guessing and imagining, they look immediately to where it is. So then we thought, okay, if we put the captions in the back of the book, so it's kind of hidden, but it needed some kind of explanation. But I would never have imagined putting my own story in there, because that to me just wasn't the point of being a photographer. And I saw myself very much as a sociologist, you know, and that sociology, that, and as maybe even as a kind of journalist, because I'd worked in magazines and I'd made magazines, and so I thought of myself as a kind of like sociological kind of making a kind of documentary, and therefore there was no space. I had to be neutral, and I felt like the narcissism of mentioning yourself, that was a narcissistic act. But what was interesting in the kind of 10 years between starting to make the book and then making it, the whole notion of authorship and neutrality changed, you know, and we became much more aware of kind of the influence of identity and the influence of the author and the gaze, you know. So the whole understanding of photography was totally radicalized, and we realized there was no neutrality. Everyone looked through their own cultural lens, and this sort of like post-colonial way of thinking was about drawing attention to what that lens, the lens through which every interpretation of the world is kind of filtered. And so suddenly to claim neutrality was no longer a kind of generous act that you know, was not narcissistic, but actually to claim neutrality was a kind of yet another kind of continuation of the kind of Western colonial way of claiming authorship or claiming truth. You know, so suddenly the whole idea that there's like a truth value became torn down. So suddenly to not talk about who I was and what my perspective, and not talk about my race and my identity when looking at all these different world cultures, suddenly became, you know, this kind of like colonial perspective. And so suddenly I felt like I had to declare you know, who I was and how I was looking at these places and why, you know, and to write myself in, because you know, suddenly another book of a Westerner looking at China, you know, wasn't plausible without talking about that. To me, I felt
that is one of these big questions. Is, well, it's a white, but I mean, you do talk about it. You do kind of directly engage with that question.
Yeah, I tried to talk about that directly. Talk about, okay, so, you know, as a white photographer looking at China, what am I saying? But actually, you know, of course, And what the whole book is about in a way that China and all these different places, and that's what I try to talk about in the writing, how they reflect back to me. You know, when I went to China, I learned not what it was to be Chinese, I learned what it was to be Western, because I was confronted with a different logic that helped me understand how much of my perspective and the things that I believed to be true were a product of my cultural upbringing. You know, so that all of the truths that I'd lived with were no longer truths. They were subjective, and so in a way I try and talk about that experience. You know, so is that, can you go out and learn about the world, or when you go out into the world, do you finally able to learn about yourself? You know, is it kind of revealing what it meant to be Western, as much as it, you know, I was confronted with all these kind of non-Western situations which I lived in, and living in those places is very different from tourism. When you go for 2 weeks, you know, you can see everything as this kind of otherness, and you're not forced to. But when you live somewhere, you have to undo your own norms in order to exist in a kind of new cultural condition. So by being in China for 6 years, I had to undo those norms. You know, I had to live in a new normal, and I had to understand the new logics. And so different from being a documentary photographer. And I talk about that in Nigeria, actually, about how actually in Nigeria was the first place I went to where I only stayed for a couple of weeks. And so therefore it was the only place that was more like a kind of documentary photographer or press photography, or the kind of traditional documentary photographer, where Westerners have gone into places, like photographed it, made this kind of like instant judgment without adapting or with really understanding the rules, just seeing the differences. And then you have this very kind of exoticized kind of picture of a different place. And so that was the problem when I was trying to write about Nigeria, is that I wanted to write about how, in a way, my experience there was different from the other places. So in a way, you know, I wanted to be obvious, reveal that, and be honest about how that my photographing Nigeria was a much more conventional process of a documentary Western documentary photographer, you know. And at the same time, I was very aware of it was also the most kind of complicated, because Africa has always been kind of seen through the white gaze, you know. So it was yet another. I also understood the complexity of that, you know, and at the same time. But at the same time, Nigeria was really important in my book, because there was so much of Nigeria in the other cities that I had.
I was just going to say that.
You know? So because I had sort of photographed this Nigerian community in China. And
I was just going to say that those connections are quite interesting, because maybe you can't trace it back to London, but you can certainly trace it back to China.
Yeah, and London, of course, there's a massive.
Yeah, and London, of course, but there is more of a. I mean, what I'm trying to say, you're much more detached in Africa, in Nigeria, but somehow those photographs still, if you had them right after London photographs, maybe they would feel more different than they are as you have them following the story of China. So somehow, I think China is this kind of intermediate state of mind.
Yeah. Well, also the sort of, because there was in Guangzhou, there was such a it's like the largest African community in Asia, and it's really sort of dominated by Nigerian traders who live there. So it's a really kind of Niger. So then, so in my book, I go from the Nigerian church in China to the Chinatown in Nigeria. So I'm talking about, so I go through one portal into the other place. So they're really portals. You know, but of course, for me, Nigeria was very familiar because of particularly because of the kind of colonial architecture. So I recognized it. It was a very visually, and in terms of architecture, it's very familiar. You saw the same kind of brutalist kind of buildings that I had lived with in North London, also that kind of same style in Nigeria. And so, you know, obviously the presence of England and like English, the kind of like colonial influence also gave it another kind of familiarity. So that was what was interesting about Nigeria. Even though I went there so briefly, I recognized it from, you know, firstly, I knew the kind of like music being played from the radios because of the African clubs in China that I went to, where I socialized. And then also, of course, I knew so much about, I was so familiar with sort of Nigeria, firstly, because of the English influence on Nigeria, but also there are so many Nigerians in London. So there was something deeply familiar. So I talk about the kind of historic basis of that familiarity, you know, and also because and this kind of futuristic basis of the familiarity, which comes from the kind of growing connection between China and Africa. And again, when I went to Dubai, there was also a lot of Nigerians in Dubai who are kind of, so because Nigerians are basically dominating, you know, global trade between Africa and the rest of the world. So their influence through the kind of global market is huge.
Did the name really come from this image?
Yeah, it came from the perfume, and it was a Chinese made rip-off of Sex and the City perfume.
Of course.
And it was I found it in a wholesale market in Dubai. So a wholesale market in Dubai caters to kind of traders from all around the world who come to Dubai rather than go to China, who go to Dubai rather than go to China to source goods, because Dubai is obviously another kind of major trading hub. And so because it was like a Chinese made perfume rip-off of a kind of Western brand, and to me Sex in the City is kind of the ultimate Western like invention and the Western brand, you know, and you know, these kind of sex obsessed like pseudo feminist women from New York, you know, have been exported around the world to kind of has come to represent like Western morality and Western values. And so so in a way, that perfume suddenly brought together all the other places that I was talking about. It was kind of Chinese in Dubai, you know, catering to kind of like Nigerian like traders, you know, and then this again, it was a kind of, for me, it was like, oh, this is how Western values are understood. This is, again, it reflected back to me because, of course, I'm this Sex in the City typology, you know, and suddenly realized that Sex in the City has influenced how the world sees me. And I've always looked for these meeting points where all these different cultures kind of collide, you know. So a lot of the pictures are like that, where I've tried to, so for instance, there's a picture of a kind of, you know, where I've tried to take pictures where these five cities meet in different ways, basically.
Yeah. I mean, there is also one underlying narrative in the book, and that is the narrative of the art world, because it seems to be a way in some way. I don't know how. Like, you know, it's a point where you start, but then you unpack it again in a way that, again, we see, well either I would call the absurdity. I don't know if you would call it that.
I mean, definitely there's a cynicism about it.
Yeah.
And I think there is a cynicism, like in the art world, definitely. I mean, it can be very cynical. And the cynicism, in a way, is kind of inevitable, is that the art world kind of takes on moral issues, and yet it's part of this kind of incredibly corrupt kind of financial system. But definitely that's only part of the story, you know. So there's what I saw, I mean, the art world, and that's why I talk about the art world in all these different cities, you know. It means something completely different everywhere you go, you know. And at the same time, there's some sort of universal processes that are happening because of the art world, you know. So universally, whether you go to London or Dubai or Guangzhou, universally, like, you can find areas, or Lagos, you can find areas that were kind of industrial areas somewhere in the city, poorer parts of the city, that are being taken over by the art world. So they're part of a kind of redevelopment, or the development of parts of the city, and usually poorer parts of the city or older parts of the city that are kind of and so, you know, in Guangzhou, in Dubai, in London, you know, you see old factory districts being taken over by museums and gallery spaces. That's kind of like a universal model, and that's being it's a kind of Western art model that's being applied across the world.
And I think that one thing that I mean, you talk about creative class, and I think that is maybe the better way to put it, is, you know, there is always a class of artists, or maybe we shouldn't call it class, but there is, you know, artists move around the cities and, you know, regenerate. And I think this is one of the things we mentioned in our previous conversation. And on top of that, there is this kind of world that is generated by it, right? Which is in a way quite detached from reality. So I think maybe that is where I saw the kind of very interesting point in your work, is that there is a real discrepancy. It's like a parallel reality that is really so detached from urban experience. I mean, it contributes to that experience in its kind of detached nature.
The thing is that art is a kind of, you know, it's connected to kind of luxury. There's this kind of connection to luxury, and that's why, you know, and art openings everywhere, even in Dubai, where alcohol was supposedly illegal, there's champagne being drawn, like the champagne is semiotically connected to kind of the art, to art. And so it represents luxury. It represents luxury and wealth, right? And at the same time, the artist is in this strange position of having to. It's the last remaining art world. It's also the last remaining space where we can really like investigate moral issues and moral questions. And the artist, and also particularly the photographer, has always been the person to kind of talk about poverty and create portraits of poverty and inequality. And, you know, that's, you know, so you go to Venice Biennale, and there's like lots of projects about refugees, you know, and these are projects about the kind of most marginalized, you know. It's this kind of strange conflict where we have to discuss and be the voices of the marginalized people, because that's what the art world is kind of creating space for, or should create at its best, a kind of, you know, a place where morality is discussed, maybe even outside of politics and outside of like other competing agendas. And at the same time, it's made by predominantly middle-class people, and it's funded by predominantly upper-class people. So there's this strange kind of, you know, class system within the art world that sometimes, you know, sometimes you can, that's why photography can sometimes feel like pain porn, because, you know, you can have photography exhibitions where people drinking, upper class people drinking champagne are kind of enjoying the kind of aesthetic beauty of the pain of some of the most impoverished people in the world. And there is that that inherent conflict within the art world that it doesn't know how to reconcile, you know, and in a way, artists kind of does their best, you know what I mean? And at the same time, though, they willingly participate in a kind of corrupt system, you know, and they also, you know, seek to capitalize from both ends of things. And at the same time, in terms of developers and development, if you look at what happens to cities, artists are also the ones who go into poor parts of the city, and they move in and they kind of ripen an area, you know, for rich developers to come in. And so in a way, this kind of gentrification of cities has artists at its kind of core, or maybe not at its core, but the beginning stages of gentrification are almost always done by artists. Just by artists who are, you know, poor, technically, you know, have low income, so definitely they move into low income areas, but they just change the demographic, you know, so they're also part of that system. And so I'm critical, you know, I am an artist, but I'm aware of that system, you know, and therefore I have a kind of difficult relationship, as every artist has, with the art world, you know.
So in which city do you feel you felt the most comfortable as an artist?
Well, so I talk about basically like in London, you know, so in my story about having a stroke in the yoga class, I wanted to tell these huge moral conflicts as anecdotes and as jokes and as funny stories, you know, so because I didn't want to talk about, the book is all about the problems of the world, but everyone's always talking about the problems of the world, you know, we're obsessed with the problems of the world, and where everyone's obsessed with saving the world and ending the problems of the world, and you know, that's what we have TED for. You know, so I didn't want to get in on that discussion. And I also didn't want to be the artist moralizing about what was right or wrong when I know my own culpability in, you know, in this conflict. So I didn't want to just replicate that. So I wanted to tell, you know, when I talk about my having a stroke in a yoga class, that's how I talked about gentrification, you know, and that's how I talked about this kind of the way that, you know, in order to deal with our moral conflicts, you know, Westerners sort of take this kind of empty exoticization of kind of Eastern culture as providing us with the ideologies to deal with our moral conflicts. So, and the kind of dangers of that, you know, but so I talked about going to a yoga class, living in Hackney in East London, which had been a kind of, you know, an immigrant area, which had been a kind of like poorer part of the city, which was very culturally diverse, and was, when I moved there, and over the space of time, you know, as it became an art area, you know, like immigrants through rising rent, immigrants were moved out, but that this kind of culture that we started to replace, rather than like real Indian immigrants who had previously lived there, we were instead putting in their place, you know, commercialized versions of Indian culture. So sort of like a Bikram yoga class appeared, in its place, you know, and that was kind of populated by white artists like myself, you know, and so my stroke in this yoga class was potentially a kind of just a recognition of the the problem with that and the enormity of that and the danger of that.
Yeah. So am I then right to assume that London really set you for life in a way, that London really gave you all these tools that then you used in all these other cities?
Well, I saw a very London was a very pained city. It was really a painful city. It was not it was not a joyful city, you know. When I grew up in North London, like, you didn't look people in the eye. Do you know what I mean? There was this sort of abject violence. It's very dark, you know, and very kind of also very impoverished, you know, almost sort of Dickensian kind of darkness that had remained there, you know. Like, I went to school with people who were couldn't eat, you know. There was sort of this presence of poverty was quite was very obvious and very difficult and very sad, you know. And then I saw that the city, which became kind of gentrified in my lifetime. So I saw the whole city change. So these parts of the city which had been really impoverished, or even these brutalist like council estates, you know, which were now suddenly, you know, 30 years later, 40 years later, yet like cost millions. You had to be a millionaire to live in these parts of, in these houses that, you know, that were for the kind of most impoverished people. And the irony of that was just so obvious, you know, and it's just like, I've tried to get my head around that, you know. And so these kind of very obvious ironies are most glaring in London, I would say, or very glaring in London. You see it in New York too. You see it in, it's the process, it's what's happened to most global kind of cities. But at the same time, you see that the new wealth that came to London wasn't spread equally, you know. So suddenly we can now know that kind of the development and what capitalism promised us and what the global market economy had supposedly promised didn't materialize, you know, and actually it's just led to kind of more extreme inequalities and wealth, you know. So that the millionaires who bought these council houses recently live still with the generations of families, you know, working class families who have lived there, you know, previously. So, and so in a way, this kind of like, these conflicts have become more pronounced and closer to each other.
I think it's interesting how you start from looking at these rapidly growing and changing environments, such as China, Nigeria, Dubai, from that starting point of having observed London rapidly change. But then to conclude, you go to America, you go to Houston, where it is West.
Yeah.
Yet you've had quite a weird task to photograph art collectors in Houston. And then that resulted in a kind of series of events that I guess in some way or another define your life. And it's all very personal, but there is a certain detachment. It's like, do you kind of feel like guarding your life from the work?
Well, that's the thing. I didn't want to tell, you know, I could tell all my personal, I didn't tell my personal story. I just used myself, where anecdotes myself could stand in for, they were kind of metaphors for other, you know, bigger issues, you know. So I didn't want to, it wasn't a kind of like chronological biography at all. I just sometimes had to talk about myself, so I could talk about a, you know, so for instance, when I talk about becoming a DJ in China, you know, that allowed me to talk about the kind of, you know, certain values and what was happening in culture, but told through my own experience, because that anecdote, you know, revealed everything I needed to say. So I didn't need to you know, I didn't want to kind of make anything conclusive. I didn't want to have to give the conclusion. I wanted to give the anecdote that suggested it. So I used personal anecdotes just to suggest it so that the reader could make the conclusion that I had already made, you know. And for me, that was really important, that this book isn't about answers. This book isn't about, you know, statements about what is going on.
Yeah.
I could talk about, you know, I could, you know, suggest things, you know, without being heavy-handed, you know, because the whole subject of the book could be, it's about kind of race inequality. It's about, you know, development. All these things are very large issues, very heavy-handed, you know, you could at least talk about them in a kind of very heavy-handed way, you know. And I wanted to be political, talk about global politics without being political. And the only way I could do that is through telling these kind of anecdotes that said enough, you know. And I really wanted the reader to make the judgment, you know. I didn't want to create a perfect argument. I wanted the reader to make up their minds. So it's I
think you do that in the book. I think I mean, personally, I think you are successful in that, because I don't feel an imposition at all. I mean, even the text, I actually really enjoy the text because it's not a journalistic kind of text, but yet it just gives that angle that you're talking about.
And they were like captions to the photographs. So it's just that sometimes in order to explain the pictures of what it was, I had to reveal, you know, rather than say this is the, you know, an art gallery and blah blah, I could tell a story. So give an anecdote that explained the picture without a kind of precise factual, you know. It allowed me to tell a story and give captions without creating facts or locations or, you know. So it was just a way, my personal experience was a way of captioning the images because I was always there. I didn't want to make it the kind of story of my life, you know.
And so just on this point about concluding with Houston, having observed development and rapid development in China, Africa, and Dubai, and having started that observation in London, how did Houston tie into that conversation?
Well, can I actually go back first to the question that you asked before about, because when I say, like, for instance, we talk about the art world, you know, and so I talk about the art world and myself being part of this kind of like system of gentrification that was kind of happening in the West, in the art world. And then I wanted to talk about the different iterations of the art world, because I went to China, and it meant something totally different being in China and being a photographer, you know. Firstly, when there wasn't this kind of, where it wasn't governed yet by the kind of elite upper classes, because there isn't the same upper class in China. There are beginning to be kind of art collectors, but that was just starting. So actually I made exhibitions for cities, you know. So when I worked on the Shenzhen Biennale, it was created by the city of Shenzhen, and it was for the city of Shenzhen. So I remember it was amazing. It was an architecture biennale that on the first day it opened, like thousands of school children turned up. So I came into the exhibition and it was filled with like 5-year-old kids who were literally like kicking the installations and destroying them, you know. So it was like, it really was for the people, you know. So this different political context, you know, and it was by the government. So it was a public thing. It was a completely different audience, you know. And at the same time, also when I did photography exhibitions in China, it was really exciting because firstly there was this sort of group of young artists in China who were for the first time using the internet and using magazines and using photography to communicate, and art was a kind of secret language amongst these kind of young people in which to kind of digest their experience. I talk about going to this disused karaoke bar where there's all these sound artists, and they've made these crazy, and you know, they're just these like super nerdy computer guys who just listening to their sound art pieces alone in a disused karaoke bar. And that's really them attempting to digest, you know, this noise pollution, and that is stemming from this crazy development that's happening in their city. So it's really a way, art became a way from them to share and understand the experience of the change and massive changes that were happening in their own country and their own culture, you know. So suddenly in that context, or even as being a photographer, my first exhibition was of photos of Egypt, you know, and when I showed it, when I showed it to when I exhibited it for the first time, I was struck by being at the opening, and everyone was spending time, the audience was spending time looking at the photos. And I was like, wow. And there was no alcohol at the opening. And there was no socializing, because it was an opportunity to look at photos of a place that hadn't been seen before, you know. So I realized that in a country like China, where there was very limited access to, you know, images of the outside world until then, suddenly this was like real information, you know, and this was a real window, you know, and it was what photography had been in the past, or what it was supposed to be, you know. It was, and it was interesting that people at an opening were looking at the art rather than looking at each other, which usually would happen in an opening in London. And then again in Dubai, you know, so what was interesting to me was Dubai was how many these incredibly young, determined women were in the art world. And it was a really feministic space, you know, within that kind of context, that, and it was very much about a kind of shifting of power rather than this kind of problematic power relationship that you couldn't get out of, that I feel it is very often in the West, you know. So and when you say where was it the best place to be an artist, you know, definitely it was Dubai. I found most exciting, because firstly you weren't you know, the issues and the problems that were being vocalized were kind of broader, and it wasn't based on this strange class system, you know, because the whole idea of class was different, you know. So, you know, people were making work about the struggle of you know, the ruling elites and their children, do you know what I mean, who had you know, had to break out of the kind of the power structures themselves. So it wasn't so much anymore about the wealth, and the idea of who's a have and have not was kind of totally changed. Not that there isn't massive economic inequalities in all of those countries, but it was just different. It meant something different, you know, and it was much more controlled by, kind of less controlled by the establishment, and it was much more part of a kind of youth culture and youth and empowerment of kind of young people. So it was about the empowerment of a new generation who were finding a voice. That's what I saw in the kind of art world in China and the art world in Dubai, and the art world in Nigeria too, actually, you know, that it was much more people talking about their issues, their own issues, rather than kind of the other, you know, which is the focus sometimes of a lot of art in London, or particularly I find as a photographer. But anyway, so going to Euston was somehow return to that, you know. I book habit with two, because it also made me understand, suddenly I came, you know, back to the West, but having understood what the West meant, you know. And at the same time, I had looked at how American culture kind of has become embedded or appropriated in all these different parts of the world and how it's been changed, you know. And particularly I talk about one of the kind of things in hip hop culture that has become most appropriated and adopted in different parts of the world is hip hop culture. And so I talk about being a kind of a European hip hop head, and so through the book, what that means, you know, and how an art form like that kind of, in a way, forms a kind of aesthetic for this kind of universal global culture, because there's certain things that you see everywhere, certain styles. There is a kind of universal urban global culture, and its roots, starting points, you know, was maybe, you know, like urban culture from New York from maybe the 80s. You know, you could say that was the kind of start in its DNA as that, you know, and in its DNA as hip hop culture. And so it was interesting going back, therefore, to America, to where, firstly, that kind of that DNA was born, you know, but then also having understood what it meant to be European, and understanding, firstly, when I went to China, I realized there was a whole other history of the world, you know.
Yeah.
And so suddenly I had to question everything that I'd been taught in school as a student of the West, you know, I was forced to question everything that I had known about, you know, global history. And then, of course, I came to Houston, where the kind of, I'd lived in New York before as a student. But in Houston, obviously, it was an incredibly racially segregated city. And you know, the rich white people in Houston live still in kind of prefabricated, like, versions of colonial mansions, you know? So to a certain extent, the colonial history of America, of Europe, is most on display there still in this strange kind of new current form, you know. So that confronted me with my Europe, the in effect my European history in another way, you know, and
all the conflicts that exist within the American society, I guess.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Which are kind of emblematic of global conflicts, probably.
Exactly. Yeah.
The thing you said about Dubai being I like how you answered my question from earlier on. You've answered it now. It's like I didn't realize that you didn't answer it previously about Dubai being a kind of really, from all of those cities, being a place where as an artist you felt very comfortable. And I think there's something interesting in that almost like, I mean, there is a degree of oppression in Dubai, even though it is one of the most open Arab states. It's still controlled. It's still kind of totalitarian. It's
an
pretty much
authoritarian system.
Authoritarian, yeah. And it's interesting because some people I've been speaking to as part of the series are people that have lived in Yugoslavia, for example, and during communism, where really the cultural production was flourishing. Was flourishing during the oppressive, what one would say was oppressive communism. There was an understanding of, you know, granting a degree of freedom to artists, but also just giving space to artists is a kind of really important thing in society. So, you know, even the kind of oppressive communists have done it in Yugoslavia. I mean, Yugoslav communism perhaps was less oppressive than some other forms of communism that existed. But it's an interesting thought to you know, at what point does art become an issue? And, you know, you almost kind of, these authorities, and they almost kind of have to weigh how much they give, because they know that they have to generate cultural production, that is really a critical thing. Yet you know, there is a balance, and then artist at the same time has to respond. You know, as an artist, you kind of have to know that this is a kind of balancing act.
Of course, and then of course, you know, what was happening, the kind of control of the establishment that we have in the West, you know, which comes through the fact that artists need to get funding of governments. We need the approval of art institutions. You know, of course, it's the collectors and the art institutions who censor the artist, and yet at the same time they don't have the kind of weight, and it's not done with the same kind of like terror and authoritarianism.
But it's almost like more terror than authoritarian regimes.
Yeah, so of course it's very different. You know, that means, of course, in what you can say in China in a exhibition, it's completely different from what you can be way less critical, overtly critical of the government. You know, you can be. And how Ai Weiwei has Ai Weiwei is a perfect example, you know, of the kind of, you know, how the limits of what can be said. So that is a thing and that's of course the and that scary thing of the art world. So where it also provides a cover for so much like oppression and repression. So governments like the Chinese government and like the Dubai government, they know that in order to seem like they are modernizing, to seem like they are open, to seem like they are tolerant, there needs to be a presence of the art world. So the art world can also mask, you know, something. It's also a mask, you know, and that's why these governments actually throw a lot of money behind art areas. So it becomes, yes, totally. It becomes another, and that is a problem with the art world. So exactly. So as much as I said that art world was different, and I gave a kind of positive view of that difference, you know, the reason artists are talking about their own experience rather than the experience of others is because, you know, even just there are so many topics that they can't even begin to start on, you know. So I'm not saying that art world in the other parts of the world are more open or more different. The problem is that as soon as we start talking about these issues, you know, we're almost, and this is the problem that I have in all my discussions, and this is why in a weird way I almost don't want to talk about my book. The book is the only way of talking about it, because the minute I talk about it, I omit, you know, the minute you talk about these things, you have to say, oh, as much as it's open, it's also repressed in this way. You know, in every single system, or you're almost called to make judgments on the political system. And I wanted to show the systems and talk about them without talking about them as being bad or good or scary, not because they're not bad or good, but I didn't want to make that judgment on it. That's what I wanted. I wanted to leave a kind of, you know, saying these were the things that I noticed. And of course, there's a limit to what I noticed, you know. So as much as I say that these school children were invited by the government, you know, when I say that these school children were invited by the government, and that means it's a kind of open, it's for the people. At the same time, for that reason, there can be none of the kind of criticality of that government because of that audience in mind, you know. And so I dealt with censorship in working in China. I had to deal with that all of the time, you know, and I had to work within the parameters of kind of a highly censored environment in China and also in Dubai. In Dubai, a less explicit form of censorship. But if you're making an exhibition in either of these places, you know, it's made with the permission of the government. But the problem is I didn't want to talk about that. you know, because that's in there, you know, that's there. And then that's the beauty of photography, is that, you know, you never have to, that's what I love about photography, is you don't have to say anything clearly, you know. And actually I wanted, and we are all, the discussions about authoritarian government and how, and what is an authoritarian government, and what is the impact of censorship, and what can we say, and, you know, that's a discussion that's being had, you know, and everyone feels like they know what's right or wrong based on the information they have about different regimes. Everyone has that, you know, and we all are constantly talking about everything in terms of a kind of morality and, you know, political morality. And that's why we have this kind of polarization, you know, because, and then that's why it's become such a weird thing, you know, this whole cancel culture, you know, like I was talking, I'd made an exhibition with my mum about, and she's a kind of like old school surrealist, you know, and we talked about surrealism and how, what interesting, and maybe the final moment in art, when artists were allowed to talk about their dark side and their sexual perversions, you know, and their real, you know, before political correctness, art was a place to explore the darkest part of you know, and that's what surrealism
the incorrectness,
sorry?
The incorrectness.
Yeah, or it wasn't correct or incorrect, you know, before there was no just the kind of different sides, you know, and the different things, you know, and that was maybe maybe that was the last real moment of openness in art, because you could talk about yourself as a pervert, you know what I mean? And it was about your subconscious, and it was about, and that's something you can't control and you don't have to own, you know. And now we don't talk about these things anymore. Everything is about kind of highly politicized kind of viewpoints, you know. And that's why, in a way, when I talk about my book, it's the wrong thing to do. And even today, I was like, actually, last thing I should do is talk about my book, because I put everything in these kind of categories. And I've then, you know, I remember I was talking on the news, I was talking on, I had the thing, an article about my book in the Dutch newspaper. And I talked about how in Dubai, you know, my photograph of these, in Dubai, there was a kind of, to a certain extent, an openness that I didn't find in the West. And I got, this guy wrote to me and he was like, you're not talking about the labor camps in Dubai and the exploitation. And it's like, I am talking about that in the book. It's right there on page 65. I go into the labor camps and I talk about the exploitation of workers, you know, as I do talk about the kind of exploitation of factory workers in China. And it's all there, but I photographed it. Do you know what I mean? And if I don't mention it in one instant, doesn't mean it's on my register and it's not part of the totality of my 15 years experience, which is all in the book, you know. So in an hour, I can only bring out these things.
But I think I agree. But I also think, like, I think what's interesting is that I was asking you questions about rapid transformation from China to Houston, but actually the link to Houston may not be the rapid transformation. Maybe what led you to Houston is the actual thread on art world. So there are so many different threads that lead you to different places, and they're not necessarily all talking about one thing or everything, you know. I think that is a really interesting point, that not everything talks about everything. And
exactly, and that's a problem. Even now I talk about, you know, am I talking about London? Am I talking about Dubai? I've been to the Dubai city, but, you know, like, I'm talking about China, but what's happening in, like, you know, the west of China, I was living in East South China, it's completely different, and I don't know that context, you know. And
I mean, I also have the Tokyo book in front of me, which I think is your incredible contribution to study of architecture.
Oh, thank you.
Which, again, we're not talking about. But can we just talk about how long were you in Japan to produce all these photographs?
I think I was there like a month or something.
Okay, so more than you were in Africa.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was like, yeah, 3 weeks to a month. I did a lot of traveling. I was thinking about that book actually yesterday, because I was thinking how sad it got so badly distributed in the West. It's actually kind of
Project Japan.
Oh no, that book. I thought you talked about my
Oh.
Metabolism book.
Oh, sorry. No,
You
no,
know,
no.
you know that I made
Sorry. I was
another.
like, this is very well
Oh no, not that book.
spread
That
out.
wasn't my book.
Well, it's not your book, but I think the context into which you plugged in your photographs and actually the work, your photographs, I mean, are really tell the story of the book. I mean, I don't know if you. But there's also the Metabolism book. Sorry, I don't know. I just have this in front of me.
No, that's a book I made where I actually told the stories wrote the stories, and it was just my photos in
yes. Your Metabolism book, yes.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Well,
yeah,
that one I haven't got. That one I haven't got. But yeah, no, I know that's a good book.
Well, that's but that book I really tried to, was the first time I really wrote about architecture, you know what I mean? I wrote about it. I described the buildings, you know, and I tried to, but and that was my first thing really engaging with architecture, the first and last time. But yeah, go ahead.
No, but I mean, I just think, you know, back to our earlier point about your dialogue with architects and, you know, how much you take from Rem and how much Rem takes from you. I mean, this book is a real example of that.
Yeah,
you know,
well,
it's like
without going to claim credit for anything that Rem does, or, you know, like, but I think in a way, yeah, of course, architecture sort of like maybe can benefit, you know, something, a kind of such an academic and serious record of a moment like that can benefit from a kind of outside kind of non-architectural sociological perspective, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's metabolism as it is, rather than as we all this kind of romanticized image of it. This is the kind of exciting, the exciting element in your photography.
Yeah, and like what I loved about the Metabolism buildings is, like, you know, they were characterized by these big round windows, and then like 50 years later, IKEA opened, you know, and then no one was to know that everyone was going to get their blinds from IKEA. So suddenly you have these kind of square IKEA blinds in front of these round windows. And then you realize that, of course, like the whole intention of the architect and the aesthetic is totally subverted by, you know, a lot of the people who were putting kitsch, you know, little, you know, the older people that lived in some of these residential metabolist projects, you know, loved lace curtains. And, you know, it was so absurd to have little trinkets in the windows of these super modern kind of buildings. And that's what I love. I love the way that everything, you know, the ideals get subverted and changed by life, you know, and so that's what I did in the Metabolism, and that's what I wanted to show about the cities, and is that the life of the city, that human life, completely had its own plan that was completely outside of the ideals of the political structures or the political order, you know. So and so that's human resistance, you know, and so that's why I didn't want to talk, or I did, of course, talk about China, because you can't ignore it. But when we talk about China, when we talk about Dubai, we always talk about these political systems, you know. So we talk about China as communist, we talk about, you know, Dubai as authoritarian, and we talk about ourselves as capitalist, but there are all these other systems, you know, that people generate and invent, you know, that are totally outside of that, you know. So within an authoritarian system like China, you have these pockets, like I talk about the urban villages, you know, which are in some of the most, you know, these totally regulated cities. You can still have these cities within the city that are completely unregulated, and, you know, the developers you know, are built with no rules whatsoever. So the rules always fall apart. So the rules that the government or the authority or the architect has imposed will always fall apart in certain moments. And I'm right there in those moments, you know, that's where, and that's why I'm really interested in the informal things and the informal systems and the informal systems that help people thrive, you know, under all different kinds of conditions.
I mean, I'm just looking through the project Japan, and just the Kisho Kurokada, just showing one of his kind of greatest projects. You take a picture of a sort of insane junction, cables and ducts and pipes.
Yeah.
The kind of greatest Japanese metabolist.
Well, that's the thing, you know, everything will always fall apart and a new thing will happen, you know.
Yeah. And these pipes will emerge from nowhere. And
exactly. And you
as an architect, you'll never have a control over it.
You'll never be able to leave room for what's going to happen in the future. You can only make a very vague prediction, you know, and I mean, that's also the thing that I did a photo of the Biblioteca Lorenziana in Florence. And so it was sort of one of, you know, it was Michelangelo's first architectural project.
Yes,
so it had like huge significance. And then I photographed it. But no one could imagine. So it's all about like, he's used lights and to create kind of different versions of gray, you know? So it's this incredibly thought through space obsessively thought through space in terms of shadow and light and what would happen. But of course, Michelangelo didn't know that eventually the people there were going to be lights, LED lights, strip lights installed, you know, and suddenly you have these like lamps that give this kind of green glow, which was completely not expected. So suddenly, you know, the influence, and that's again the influence of IKEA or whichever kind of monopoly hardware store they were buying these lights at, you know. So suddenly like the intentions are completely corrupted by one form of LED light that someone you know decided to install, and it on a whim, and it totally changed everything. And I love those moments, you know. Also, where do you put a fire exit, you know, in a Michelangelo?
Yes.
And it's like with the Michelangelo, you know, that's how I'm different from an architect, and that's why I don't look like an architect. I don't see like an architect, because when I see these bits of plastic that are stuck together with duct tape to cover up the wires that are illuminating this beautiful room with this horrendously garish green light, I laugh, I love it, you know. And I'm with an architect who's like, this is horrible, you know, this is awful, this is the perversion, you know. And I love it that, you know, Michelangelo got fucked like that. I'm like, yes, you know,
I mean, they also have it
there's no irreverence in my
fantastic.
photographs, you know, to any of these things.
And the whole kind of subjecting Michelangelo on another level is like subjecting him to tourists. I remember in Rome, when you go to see his Moses, there is like a box you can put in, I don't know, like 50 cents to light him up, because otherwise you can't really see Moses. It's kind of in shadow.
Yeah, exactly. So LED lights, that's a presence of China now, you know. China is kind of
where they made
every single part of, you know, European history. The way we see it is through this kind of Chinese lens now, you know. And
but there is an elephant in the room in this conversation, which is that your book is now a little bit of a artifact to a life that is long gone. You know, like coronavirus.
That's definitely true. Yes.
So how do you feel about that? Like, do you think this will ever happen again?
Yeah, well, there's so many conditions there that will cease to exist, you know. So even the urban villages, these unregulated, like dirt was eliminated, I think, from China, you know. So, and even I've taken lots of photos where there's people living with animals, you know, which was this kind of ancient condition that, you know, in a way for me showed about how kind of Chinese culture is so much more than the frame of like the last 50 years of communism with which we see it, you know, and actually the kind of ancient lives still exist in these very modern cities. And potentially coronavirus was the chance to eliminate those lives, you know, and so even things like density, you know, which was so much, and crowds, and so much a part of Chinese life, was being together with a lot of people. You know, that doesn't exist. Or
I mean,
even
starting from
in
art
London,
openings,
I take photos of carnivals and things, you know, that these things might never exist again. Who knows?
Well, we
You know,
hope they will, but
sorry?
I mean, we hope they will.
Maybe it will, but we just don't know, you know, we have no idea. We have no idea what the changes will be, you know. For instance, now in Houston, you know, it's become a kind of moneyless kind of society, you know, and everything is done now with cards, and that will never change, that will never go back, you know. So you have all these kind of like the illegality has been eradicated and informality has been eradicated on a massive scale, and so much of what's in the book is about the things that were illegal and the things that were kind of just ignored or outside of the pockets of government control. And that might never happen again. Also, it was all about traders and people living in one country moving between countries, you know. And now we found a way to do trade. Now every factory in China that needed a kind of Nigerian trader to go there to buy things has probably set up a system online where it's no longer necessary, you know. So the whole idea, you know, I was talking about this kind of global world where there's this total interdependency and that new cultures are being invented. We had to go somewhere to buy something. And so even though we talk about global capitalism and often in these very static terms, it actually there was a lot of creativity and a lot of things happening and a lot of kind of cultural exchange. That was the exciting part of globalization, was that people were forced into these meetings and forced to live amongst each other. And that might never happen again. And, you know, and now you can't go anywhere. You know, I lived in China for 6 years on a tourist visa. You know what I mean? And now you can't get in without now the whole visa restrictions. So it's definitely, I finished it just before Corona. And as I was watching the news, I was like, oh my God, this instantly became, it's about everything that led to this moment, you know, and it instantly became a historic document. But that's also, again, the beauty of a book, because a book is always a record of a moment, and
documentation.
Photography as well is that it becomes instantly a kind of historic document, and therefore its meaning will really constantly change. But that, again, I knew that, you know, I knew that because I remember when I made this exhibition for Dubai in 2008, and it was about the incredibly rapid like growth of the city. And so I'd taken all these photos of these building sites being, you know, with this what's it called, scaffolding, and it was a kind of sign of potential and a sign of wealth. And then 3 years later, I did that exhibition in Dubai, and the economic crisis had happened, and suddenly those same building sites sort of had just, the scaffolding had stopped and the scaffolding had been removed, and they were all sort of falling apart. And suddenly that same image meant something completely different. It was, you know, so, and that was amazing because in 3 years, the whole situation had completely changed. So I had made the exhibition and it was called Dubai Next, about Dubai being, you know, the next economic power. And we called it Dubai Then. You know, when by the time the exhibition came to Dubai, we called it Dubai Then because it the meanings of the photos had completely changed. And that's the beauty of photography. And that's again why I wanted to just give my own personal stories and these sort of strange anecdotes that were maybe outside of being conclusive. And so they were stories without, I wanted to create captions without a caption because the caption would turn out to be dated. You know, the story really happened. The caption, the meaning of the caption will change. I'd need to update the captions.
Because within the book, you see the progression in time. You know, you talk about Obama actually starting the reverse of globalization that then obviously accelerated with Trump. But in a way, we can now condense all of that and say, oh, this is pre-coronavirus. This is a record of world pre-coronavirus.
Yeah, although coronavirus, what my book really is about, you know, and that's what I noticed in China when I was there in 2005, 2006, and there was so many kind of foreigners coming. I was part of an influx of foreigners who were coming there, new foreign influence, and creating this completely new, very kind of new type of cosmopolitanism that hadn't existed there. And, you know, I wasn't, of course, the beginning of that, but when I got there was a kind of peak. And what was interesting is that already I saw, you know, from 2006 to 2008, when the Olympic Games happened, is that already, you know, Africans were being removed by the authority for not having, you know, the visa restrictions became tighter. By the time I got to Houston, I remember the year I got to Houston was the year that Obama decided you could no longer get a driver's license if you had a foreign passport, which changed my experience. But that was, of course, a kind of a massive death blow to the economy of immigrants. You know, oh no, sorry, not without foreign passport, without residency. Right? So before that, I could have, you know, I had no residency permit, so I was going in again on a tourist visa, and but he had just, so that was of course to stem the kind of economy of illegal immigrants. And so these things were already happening, you know, so actually what Corona has done. And so that was about, my book was about that trend. It was about the kind of trend towards moving away. It was about, I realized that I'd recorded, you know, when I was in Dubai I was in Nigeria in 2006, Dubai in 2007, and China in 2005. And really between 2005 and 2008 was this kind of peak globalization, I call it. It was like the moment that we really lived with each other in a way that we might never do again. And from that moment, there was a kind of slow reversal. And that was happening slowly. And Corona has created the cover. It's created the need, but also the cover to like intensify that shift. So we might think, oh, it was Corona that made it happen, but it wasn't Corona. That was already in the plans.
You just accelerated it.
It's accelerated it, and potentially, you know, it is the cover for it.
Yeah. And I think another thing that happened is that Britain left the EU completely on a hard Brexit terms, I think it's fair to say. And then you now find yourself in a really a new environment. I mean, you haven't moved anywhere in the last 2 or 3 years, but you're still in a very different place. So what is Rotterdam like today, and how do you feel that connection to a place where you grew up, which is now not connected in that kind of, in a same way that it used to be? I was
Dutch. I've always been Dutch, had a Dutch passport, but I was born and brought up in London and hadn't lived in Holland before. but I felt very Dutch because my parents were very clearly not English. Even though I grew up with lots of people who weren't English. In fact, I made my first really, truly, fully English friend when I was 19, you know? So all of my friends had been kind of like, you know, at least one parent who was an immigrant or a foreigner, or, you know, so I was kind of like English, but in this very non-English context, you know, but somehow London, the culture of London made me really much a Londoner. And that's, in a way, I think we live that in these kind of worlds where we're no longer, we don't have a nationality, but we belong to whatever cities, you know, it's more specific, it's more local where we are from. But anyway, I think it was funny because when I was like, I think 13 or 14, I had to reapply for my Dutch passport, and the European Union was already like, you know, full swing. And my mum said, I said, no, I had to decide whether I would be English or Dutch. And if I wanted to be Dutch, I had to give up my right to ever be English, right? So I had to basically sign away my Englishness. And at the time, it didn't seem like a really big decision, you know, and my mum said, well, you should just keep your Dutch passport, because if you would ever get hijacked in a plane, they're going to kill the English and the Americans first, and everyone loves the Dutch, so the Dutch will be killed last. And literally, my national identity is based on that logic of like who they're going to kill instead of a hijacking. So then I became Dutch, because it didn't seem like a decision that was really going to make a big difference. And now it's really interesting that I'm locked out, you know, I can't move back to where I was born, you know, and so suddenly that became a huge decision. And I'm not sure if I would